What this is an exploration of the superhero in the American experience. What we mean by this is that we're contextualizing the superhero as an artifact of the American experience. And it's a unique form of American culture. And when I say American, I mean the United States, in the sense that the superhero genre is created in the United States, and it has sort of evolved along with the history of the country. There are superheroes in other countries, but the superhero has its roots in the American experience. And so by examining it, you get a strong sense of the changing dynamics of the American experience. So I'm going to start with the origins of the superhero, which go back further than you might realize. Typically, when we talk about the origin of the superhero, we tend to associate that, of course, with Superman. But really, I think the roots of the superhero genre go back farther to actually the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, we have the closing of the frontier. And as you can see from my little map here, 1890 represented the end of the wild spaces for Americans. What that meant is that there were no longer any places that you could go to that would be uninhabited, that had not been touched by the civilizing experience. For Americans, this was a very important moment historically. What this meant was that the civilizing experience of going out into the West and sort of creating community has been taken away. And then so all these people who have come to the United States as immigrants no longer have that experience. And so they're becoming primarily an urban audience. The West served as a kind of cultural tableau, as a place, a reference point for Americans to understand themselves and understand their society. As a result, the West played very highly in our myths and our culture and our sort of like popular culture. And in fact, when you think about it, if you look at some of the popular fiction of the 19th century, particularly dime novels, you see that Western stories are kind of idealized and exaggerated. You see Western heroes like gunfighters and Western villains like Indians, Native Americans, as the central players in the sort of transformation of the American experience. The reality, of course, is that these stories are really value-laden sort of lenses that Americans project into. They look towards the American experience. They look towards the West. They look towards that civilizing experience of creating community, and they pull value from it. But as the frontier is closed, the new reality of a more urban experience, something that many Americans for a long time have been afraid of, becomes the reality. And you can see this evolving in the popular literature of the time. If the dime novel was associated with the West and Westerns and adventures like that, what you start to see by the end of the 19th century and at the turn of the century is the emergence of new kinds of heroes in dime novels that reflect that urban existence. In fact, one of the first sort of like clearly urban characters that appear in these kind of publications is the detective. And you can see here Nick Carter is a very famous detective from this era, was very popular. And the detective is like the cowboy, except that he's associated with the city. If the cowboy has skills and beliefs and abilities that make him ideally suited for the West, then the detective is the same way, skills, abilities, and beliefs that make him ideally suited to deal with the urban problems. Urban problems, however, are very different from the frontier problems. The urban problems of the early 20th century represent a real danger in the minds of many Americans. You will know, you probably remember very vaguely that this is a time of massive immigration, massive industrialization, and massive globalization for Americans. That means that many people from different parts of the world are coming to the country. And now we often think of the United States as a country of immigrants, and that's true. But the reality is that at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the nature of immigration shifts dramatically. These are no longer sort of Western European, Anglo-Saxon immigrants, Germans or English people or Irish people. Now you're starting to see immigrants from Southern Europe, immigrants from Eastern Europe, so Russian Jews, Italians. These are radically different people. They don't speak our language. They don't have our religion. They represent a danger in the city. And really, people become quite concerned. Americans are concerned that the frontier is closed, so the civilizing experience of the frontier is gone. These people who are coming are no longer going to the frontier and Americanizing. They're staying in the city and living in squalor. Are they going to be a danger, becomes the question. So you can see this playing out in the minds of really prominent Americans. People like Theodore Roosevelt, who will go on to become president of the United States. But Roosevelt's early life is really a testament to the kinds of fears associated with middle-class American existence. Roosevelt advocated going out and really experiencing the wild as he had as a youth. And he believed it was very important for Americans in general to do this. As a young politician, he talked about the need for middle-class people, especially middle-class women, to get married and have kids. He used a term called race suicide. He referenced the problems associated with newly arriving immigrants producing more children than native-born Americans. The danger, he said, of course, was they would outproduce us and we would lose our Americanism. So this idea that the city was breeding, pardon the pun, problems, the idea that American sense of self is disappearing, these are really big problems. And they play themselves out in the literature of the period. The action-adventure literature that starts out with the dime novel and goes into pulp magazines really starts to characterize and reflect these concerns about the loss of self, about the loss of country, the problems with community. And you see a series of characters that are created in this period, the early part of the 20th century, that speaks to these concerns, speaks to the danger of the city, the hard-boiled detective who's facing the dangers of the dark and dirty back alleys of American cities like New York. Or you see characters like the Shadow, who have these sort of mystical abilities, who experiences the problems associated with traveling in the world and interacting with dangers. And you see characters like Conan or Tarzan, who are kind of what English professors refer to as natural aristocrats. What all these characters share is a kind of affirmation of a kind of Anglo-Saxon, almost American sense of self. These are people, often in the case of characters like Tarzan or Conan, who are white, that have mastered other people's skills. They've sort of gone out to the frontier. They've been hardened by the frontier. They have the skills to survive in the frontier, and they're able to do great things. Tarzan in particular is a prototype of this kind of hero, the jungle hero, that was very common in the pulp magazines of the early 20th century. Tarzan, of course, is a natural aristocrat. He crashes in Africa. His family, his parents were killed. He's raised by apes, and he teaches himself to read, not just English, but also French. And he's the best at everything imaginable in the jungle. The only person who can match Tarzan is his sidekick, an African, but he himself is actually technically a natural. He's actually an English lord, Lord Greystoke. And so what you see in a character like Tarzan, what you also see in a character like Conan, who's also a northern barbarian who goes to the city and through his adventure eventually becomes king of his own kingdom, if you ever read the Robert E. Howard stories. What you see is an affirmation of that rural, that country, those values associated with the rural, with the country, values that are very much associated with the American experience. The city is a dangerous place, but these characters carry the values that are sort of instilled with working the land and being agrarian, sort of Jeffersonian values, and apply them. And as you get more sophisticated in the storytelling in the pulp era, though, you start to see these same kind of characters, these same kind of confrontations being projected into characters like the Shadow or characters like Doc Savage. And what each iteration does, it takes those exact same premises of confrontation with the other, holding on to American values or Anglo-Saxon values, and being superior, and projects them further and further into a state of perfection. And so when you get to a character like Doc Savage, who's basically everything but a superhero, what we refer to as a proto-superhero, you see this sort of culmination of this idea. The reality, however, is something that Americans have to contend with. And in fact, during this whole period, the United States is going through an arc where they started the turn of the century doing quite well, but by the time you get to the 1930s, Americans are in a deep recession, a great recession. And in fact, the world is into a great recession. So the values associated with the American experience are in deep, deep trouble. And in fact, communism has its highest point of popularity in the United States in the 1930s. And so Americans are a little bit unsure about themselves and unsure about the ideas associated with being Americans. In this context, the characters, the adventure stories that sort of affirm the values associated with the United States, affirm the values associated with being American, they don't go far enough. The characters get more fantastic as you go on. And if you think about it in the chronological order, you see a character like Tarzan, but by the time you get to the late 1930s, the mid to late 1930s, you see a character like Doc Savage. And each one of these characters, each iteration is more fantastic, more capable, more and more and more. And this matches the desires that people have for what they want to see in their heroes. They want to believe what they want to believe about the country. But eventually, the the pressures of the Great Depression really get Americans into a point where they're in a very low point. And these action-adventure characters are supposed to represent what Americans are supposed to believe aren't enough. They can't go with just an ordinary adventurer, an ordinary man. What they need instead is a Superman. And if you think about this, Superman is a perfect example of a kind of culminating character for the American popular mind. He is an immigrant, right? He's an alien. Alien technically is another name for immigrant. He comes to this country as a child with the best kind of immigrant, despite what Republicans might tell you. And he grows up in the heartland, right? He grows up in the heartland. He imbibes all those values associated with being a good country farm boy. And then when he grows up, he goes to the city, and then using the innate cultural values, the innate biological traits of himself and his values together, he makes the city a better place. He's the perfect kind of immigrant. He's the kind of guy you want in your town. And so Superman is a perfect example of a kind of affirming narrative associated with superheroes, but really an affirming narrative associated with American cultural characters. Superman is the beginning of a golden age. He is the first superhero character, and having created him, being created by two Jewish teenagers, Siegel and Schuster, this character, Superman, really sets a new benchmark. He was amazing in every way imaginable, but he's really very much a progressive hero. Siegel and Schuster created a hero that, if you look at his early adventures, he is championing the common man's problems and solving them in a way that previous characters could not. This is at some point at the core of why Superman becomes so popular. It's true, he has powers that are special and spectacular, but characters before him had powers that were special and spectacular. But one of the things that really separated Superman was his progressive intent. He was a character that went out and got the corrupt politician to tell the truth. He was a character that went out and took the owners of the mines that had lots of workers toiling in dangerous conditions and took those people from the party and put them in the mine and forced them to recognize the problems that they were facing. Here was a man that took criminals and often treated them in a way that was, well, kind of brutal. He would dangle people over the side of a building. He would throw them up in the air. He was a bit of a bully, but he was a bully for the common man, which was a huge problem in the minds of many people. Who was looking out for the common man? One of the core tenets of the New Deal, one of the things that made FDR so appealing was he too was a hero of the common man. And Superman became very much that. But he was the first superhero character. And he pushed and created the sort of dichotomy that we associated with these characters as a genre. He created many of the tenets that we understand. There's a dual identity. There's Clark Kent and there's Superman. There is a pro-social mission. Superheroes do things because they believe it's right. And he had an emblem, a costume that let you know who he was. All these things help to define a superhero. He was the first superhero. He worked in Metropolis. He worked to make the city better. The second superhero is Batman, right? Batman, in many ways, is a little regressive, but continues on in the same vein as Superman. Batman, too, is a man who has faced the dangers associated with the city. His parents were killed when he was a young man. What does he do? He dedicates himself to making sure it never happens again to anyone else. He's also in the minds of, if you think about it very closely, the heir to the city. He comes from a wealthy family, so he's a little bit of a looking back character in the sense that he's a one-man vigilance committee. He's a vigilante, right? He rides into the city at night and he beats up on people who are bad, trying to make sure that the community is stable. So at some very basic level, with these two characters, Superman and then Batman, you see the arc of the superhero genre established. The special powers, the sort of street level vigilante character, and then every other character, oddly enough, seems to fall neatly within this paradigm. That won't be the case forever, but it's very much the case during the golden age, because once you start to see other publishers see the success of a company like DC that publishes Superman and Batman, you see the emergence of a whole series of comic companies that are producing superhero characters, many of which you've never seen before, unless you're a big fan of someone like Alec Ross, who resurrected some of these characters in a comic book called Project Superpower. But characters like the Black Terror, characters like Amazing Man, all these characters fall neatly within the framework created by Superman. These are characters that also represent those sort of affirming values. They're urban characters. They're protecting the community. They're pro-social in their mission. They're just out to help people. And they have that emblem that lets you know that they're superheroes. These are the things that make them really important.